August 1944, northern France. A pale dawn spreads across a road once ruled by the Wehrmacht. Now, it trembles under a new sound: engines. From the horizon, an unbroken column moves west. Olive-drab trucks, tank carriers, fuel bowsers, and jeeps, stretching farther than the eye can see. Diesel fumes hang low in the cool air. Canvas covers ripple in the wind. The ground vibrates not from explosions, but from motion. Hidden among the ruins of a stone farmhouse, a German reconnaissance officer raises his field glasses. His pencil stops mid-air. The convoy never ends. It moves past fields, villages, forests, a living river of steel and men. What he sees is not an army in battle, but an empire in motion, the industrial heart of the United States rolling through Europe. And, for the first time, the Germans begin to understand what they're truly fighting against. In the summer of 1944, Germany still fought fiercely, but the illusion of control was gone. The Allied landings in Normandy had cracked open Hitler's Western Front, and now a new kind of power was rising behind the line. It wasn't just tanks or bombers, it was logistics, industry on wheels. For years, the United States had built a war machine unlike anything in human history. By the time American boots touched French soil, over 90,000 vehicles had already crossed the Atlantic. Factories in Detroit, once making sedans and coupes, now produced tanks, trucks, and bombers every hour of every day. Steel from Pittsburgh, rubber from Louisiana, fuel from Texas, all converged into a single purpose: to keep the Allied advance alive. The Germans had perfected blitzkrieg, lightning war powered by precision and speed. But by 1944, that lightning had dimmed. Their fuel reserves were nearly dry. Railroads were shattered by Allied bombers. Factories that once fed the front now lay in ruins beneath smoldering rubble. Across the Channel, America had achieved what Germany could not: an economy mobilized for total industrial warfare. The American soldier didn't march alone. Behind him stood an entire nation of mechanics, welders, and drivers, every one part of a vast logistical organism. Now, that organism was crossing France. Convoy by convoy, mile by mile, it was building. A road that no army in Europe could match. A road of steel, rubber, and relentless motion. To German eyes, it was the impossible made real. They had spent years mastering how to strike fast. The Americans had mastered how to never stop. To sustain an invasion across an ocean through bombed-out ports and muddy roads required a new kind of warfare. One fought not with rifles, but with engines and schedules. In the weeks after D-Day, the U.S. Army's Transportation Corps began assembling what would become the most extraordinary supply network in military history. From the beaches of Normandy to the heart of France, they built a living artery: hundreds of thousands of vehicles, 16,000 kilometers of roads, and endless streams of fuel and ammunition. The system was called the Red Ball Express. Its mission: feed Patton's Third Army as it thundered across Europe. Its symbol: a red circle painted on trucks, marking them as the lifeblood of the Allied advance. From dawn till dusk, and again through the night, these convoys rolled. Drivers, many of them young, exhausted, and often African-American soldiers, pushed through rain, mud, and Luftwaffe strafing runs. They drove without headlights, following only the dim glow of the truck ahead. One mistake could mean disaster. But stopping was not an option. Each truck carried what the front line needed most: fuel, food, ammo, spare parts. Each hour mattered. Each delay could cost lives. By August 1944, more than 6,000 trucks were in constant motion, carrying up to 12,000 tons of supplies daily. A continuous river of movement, so vast that German scouts watching from the woods couldn't believe their eyes. The Wehrmacht's once efficient supply lines, based on horse-drawn carts and limited fuel, looked medieval in comparison. What the Germans called endless American convoys was not just power on display, it was the very definition of modern war, industry made mobile. And as these convoys thundered westward, one truth became clear. The United States was no longer supporting the war. It was driving it. Behind the thunder of engines were men, ordinary Americans turned into the pulse of the war. Most of them were barely in their 20s, trained not as soldiers, but as drivers and mechanics. Over 75% of the Red Ball Express was manned by African American troops, a segregated force fighting for a nation that still denied them equality at home. Yet on those roads they were indispensable. Private Joe Wilson, one of the drivers, recalled later, "If those trucks didn't roll, the tanks didn't move." They faced dangers far beyond exhaustion. The Luftwaffe hunted convoys from the sky. Roads were cratered, bridges blown apart, and German patrols still roamed the countryside. But these men drove on, through sleepless nights, through mud thick enough to swallow tires whole, through the wrecks of trucks that hadn't made it. They used creativity as their weapon. When fuel lines snapped, they patched them with tape. When tires shredded, they carved replacements from worn rubber. There was no glory in their mission, no medals for heroism, no crowds cheering their arrival. Only the constant roar of engines and the knowledge that, if they failed, the war would stall. They were the invisible heroes of the Allied advance, the heartbeat beneath every tank, every plane, every division pushing toward Germany. Without them, Patton's drive through France would have ended before it began. The Germans never fully understood this kind of power. Their soldiers fought bravely, but they fought alone, unsupported by such an overwhelming mechanical tide of logistics. The Red Ball drivers didn't see themselves as conquerors. They were workers, doing their duty mile after mile. But every gallon of fuel they delivered, every crate of ammunition they hauled, was another nail in the coffin of the Reich and in the dust of France. They proved that victory wasn't won by who fired the most shots, but by who could keep moving when everyone else had stopped. For the German High Command, war had always been about speed and surprise, blitzkrieg. But in 1944, they faced a new kind of storm, a war powered not by tactics alone, but by endless supply. The U.S. Army didn't just move, it flowed. Every tank that rolled, every shell that fired, was part of a chain stretching back across oceans. Behind Patton's spearhead, 6,000 trucks ran day and night, each carrying up to 10 tons of fuel, ammunition, or food. The route was marked by red circles, hence the name Red Ball Express. Where the Germans relied on railways and horse carts, the Americans built moving highways. If bridges collapsed, they built new ones overnight. If roads were too narrow, bulldozers widened them under fire. This wasn't chaos. It was orchestration on a scale the Germans had never conceived. Each truck was assigned a number, each convoy timed to the minute. Fuel dumps, repair depots, rest camps, all positioned with military precision. Every driver knew that a delay of even 1 hour could starve the front line. The Germans intercepted reports and couldn't believe them. They read that the Allies had transported over 12,000 tons of supplies a day, more than entire Wehrmacht armies could dream of receiving. Hitler called it the American madness. His generals called it the machine that cannot be stopped. Even when weather, terrain, and enemy fire tried to choke the routes, the Americans adapted. Convoys ran without headlights, guided only by taillight markers and moonlight. Maintenance crews traveled with them, repairing engines mid-journey. The Red Ball Express became more than logistics. It became the bloodstream of the Allied invasion. Without it, Patton's Third Army would have been immobilized within days. With it, they crossed France in weeks. To the Germans watching from their shattered lines, it looked impossible, an army that never seemed to slow down. But to the Americans, it was simple. They had turned fuel, steel, and organization into their greatest weapons. By early September 1944, the roads of France had become veins pulsing with American power. Patton's Third Army, fueled almost entirely by the Red Ball Express, was advancing faster than any force in modern history. German resistance collapsed village by village, not always through firepower, but through exhaustion. For the Wehrmacht, the war had turned inside out. The same generals who once commanded unstoppable panzer columns now watched their own troops starving for fuel, stranded in fields where engines coughed their last. General Heinz Guderian once said, "The engine of the tank is a weapon just as the gun." Now, the Americans had taken that truth and multiplied it 1,000 times. The climax came outside the Meuse River. Patton's columns, tanks, half-tracks, artillery, reached the water faster than intelligence predicted possible. German defenders expected weeks of delay. Instead, the Americans arrived in days. But their fuel reserves had finally run dry. Columns stopped mid-road, hundreds of tanks idling uselessly under the sun. Patton's men could see victory, but couldn't move an inch to reach it. Then, from the west, a rumble rose again. Convoys, hundreds of them, appeared over the hills. The Red Ball Express had caught up. Men leapt from their tanks to help unload jerry cans by hand. Within hours, engines roared back to life. The columns rolled forward again, smashing through German defenses stunned by the speed of recovery. To the Germans, it felt unreal. They had calculated that supply shortages would finally halt the Americans. Instead, the convoys had turned the impossible into routine, captured. German officers later described the moment as the day the war's logic broke. They had built their strategy on the belief that no army could sustain such motion. The United States had just proven them wrong, completely, undeniably wrong. The Wehrmacht still fought bravely, but in that moment, it became clear. No amount of courage could outlast an enemy that never stopped moving. As autumn deepened, the American juggernaut rolled toward the German frontier. From Normandy to the Moselle, the Red Ball Express kept the lifeline alive, through mud, fog, and enemy fire. Even as German artillery pounded the supply roads, the convoys pressed on, engines howling through shattered villages and burned-out forests. One soldier later said, "We drove by flame and fear, but the trucks never stopped." By late September, over 5.5 million gallons of fuel had been delivered, enough to power entire armies. The Germans tried to disrupt the flow, launching night raids, ambushes, even mining the routes. But every loss was replaced within hours. Every destroyed truck was repaired or swapped from reserves waiting offshore. That was the real turning point. Not a single battle, but an unbroken rhythm of replenishment. For the Americans, war had become an industrial movement. For the Germans, it was now a countdown. Patton's advance symbolized it best. When his fuel ran out again near Metz, he sent a simple message to his quartermasters: "Send gasoline, or send me mules." Within 2 days, he received thousands of gallons. No mules were needed. By contrast, across the German lines, panzers sat motionless. Officers tore maps in frustration, knowing their fuel convoys were destroyed before they even left the Rhineland. They had men, they had weapons, but they had no means to move them. A German report, dated October 1, 1944, grimly concluded, "The Americans possess an inexhaustible capacity for supply. The front can no longer be stabilized." This was the moment America's true power revealed itself, not in a single battle, but in relentless, mechanical persistence. The German army had mastered tactics, but the Americans had mastered motion. From that point onward, the outcome was inevitable. Each new convoy that crossed the French countryside marked another nail in the coffin of Nazi Germany. The Reich had been built on the myth of invincibility, but against America's endless convoys, even that myth ran out of fuel. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express had become a legend, a symbol of how logistics, not luck, had broken the back of the German war machine. In just 3 months, its drivers had transported more than 400,000 tons of supplies across war-torn France. Entire cities were fed, armed, and rebuilt behind the advancing front. For the Germans, the collapse was now visible everywhere. The once proud panzer divisions were stranded, their tanks rusting along country roads, their soldiers scavenging for food. Factories bombed by Allied aircraft could no longer replenish them. Meanwhile, the Americans seemed limitless. They replaced trucks faster than the Germans could destroy them. When bridges were blown, engineers built new ones within hours. When terrain turned impassable, they carved fresh roads through fields and forests. Captured German officers admitted they had underestimated not only American production, but American resolve. They expected industrial might. They didn't expect ordinary soldiers to drive 20 hours straight without rest, or mechanics to repair engines in the rain under artillery fire. The Red Ball Express ended its mission officially in November 1944, but by then the damage was irreversible. The German war effort was crippled beyond recovery. As the convoys wound down, they left behind more than tire tracks. They left proof of a new kind of warfare. A war where victory wasn't decided by who fired the last bullet, but by who could deliver the next one. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the legacy of America's logistics power was undeniable. The Red Ball Express had delivered not just supplies, the tempo of victory itself. Historians later called it the artery of liberation. More than 23,000 trucks, operated by over 6,000 drivers, had sustained Patton's advance from Normandy to the German border. Their effort shortened the war by months and saved countless Allied lives. Yet most of those men returned home quietly. No medals, no parades. Many of them, especially the African-American drivers, went back to a segregated America that barely acknowledged their service. But on the roads of France, they had already rewritten history. The Germans, even in defeat, could not forget what they had witnessed. Captured Wehrmacht reports described American logistics as terrifying in its scale and precision. One officer wrote, "Wherever one truck was destroyed, 10 more appeared." It was like fighting a factory that moved. In post-war Europe, the lesson was clear. Tactics win battles, but logistics win wars. America's ability to project industrial power across an ocean had crushed the Nazi dream of domination. The Red Ball Express became the blueprint for modern military supply. Chains, influencing everything from NATO operations to modern U.S. campaigns decades later. The war had proven a simple truth. An army marches on its stomach, but America's army drove on gasoline, steel, and determination. And the endless convoys that once rolled through the French countryside would forever remind the world that victory, in the end, belongs to those who win the quiet years that followed. The roads of Europe grew silent again. Grass reclaimed the ruts where tires once dug deep into the mud. But beneath those fields lies the memory of movement, the pulse of a nation that turned engines into instruments of liberation. For Germany, it was a revelation that power was no longer measured by the sharpness of a blade, but by the reach of a supply line. For America, it was a moment of truth, the proof that its factories, its workers, and its soldiers could unite into a single unstoppable force. The Red Ball Express remains more than a chapter of history. It is a symbol of endurance, of equality earned through effort, of the quiet heroism that drives victory. The men who drove those trucks did not seek glory. They simply refused to stop. And in doing so, they showed the world that wars are not only won by those at the front, but by those who make sure the front never runs dry. Engines fade, roads crumble. But the echo of those convoys, America's endless rolling storm, still hums across the decades. Hope can keep moving forward.